watching the class.
That's it. We let people here for the public notice.
Nobody left. They just stayed.
Okay.
They have riveting audit presentation.
You'll clear the house.
Well, I usually do. I'm not offended by people getting up and leaving in the middle of my presentation. It usually happens. Sorry, oh yeah, we're on first. As just the delegation.
Yeah.
Okay. And then where you're, so they're doing your, and you're, which section are you underneath?
I think he's doing, I don't have to stay for this anymore. That's another thing I'm doing.
Because you're talking to,
he's going to pull it in. He's going to pull my report into this.
okay, amend the agenda and move it up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's going to pull that in.
It doesn't make sense to kind of, put those conversations together.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome. No, I don't want to use that. Okay, that's a 30-second warning. And a 15-second warning. It's now 7:03, so we'd like to get going. We actually have a pretty long agenda today and lots on it, so we'll want to ensure we have the right time and get through this evening. So 7:03, digital clock. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of council for Wednesday, April 18th, 2018. We have an amended agenda in front of us, and there's a number of, at least one other amendment I'd like to make. So a suggestion from staff is to bring forward item 10.1, which is the 2017 draft audited consolidated financial statements, pages 194 to 249, and a report associated with that from the Manager of Financial Services. If we could bring that forward in conjunction with item 3, the delegation from NMP Consulting on the 2017 financial audit, and that way we will have the draft financial statements and the report from the manager at the same time we're considering the report from the auditors, and then the auditors could speak to that as well. So let's, with any other amendments other than that one to the agenda? I have a motion to adopt the agenda as amended. Thank you, Councillor Inkster. Councillor Lutz. All those in favour? None opposed, so we can move forward. And the first item, of course, is NMP Consulting, which are the auditors for this year. And welcome. And while we're looking at that item, we also have 10.1. Could I have a motion to receive the report? I've done that. Motion to receive the report from 10.1. Thank you. Seconded by Councillor Inkster. All those in favour? Thank you. And Councillor Mueller was wondering if I'd call the meeting to order. Oh, I didn't do the declaration of conflict. Yeah. No. I called it to order. We often start our meetings, item 1, with a reminder to councillors about any potential conflict of interest, and if there is anything that occurs during the evening, that individuals will do at that point recuse themselves. Councillor Mueller?
Yeah, I'm going to recuse for item 8.1, Parks, Lands and Roads Temporary Rental Amendment.
Thank you. And when we get to that, we'll give you that opportunity to leave. Moving then to item 3, and welcome. We met you this afternoon, and I've already forgotten your first name. But
that's okay.
Senior Auditor with NMP.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name is Corey Vanderhorst with the accounting and auditing firm of MNP. Here to talk to you today about the audited financial statements and our audit process and a few other things along the way. So I've got a slide presentation and I'll take you through some highlights of the financial statements at a higher level. I know that Ben will take you through some more details later on. Talk about our audit process, audit findings, and our independence, and then I'd like to end off with a little bit of financial analysis, look at some trends of things that have been going on at the district for the last few years with the numbers and kind of see where you're headed. I find it is nice to sometimes look at that over a little bit longer than just what happened last year. So please, if you've got questions, I'm happy to take them as we go or at the end, whichever you prefer. And I will pause after each kind of section if there are any.
Thank you.
So starting with the financial statements of the district for the 2017 year, we start with the statement of financial position. So this is what we used to call the balance sheet, a snapshot of what's in the accounts on December 31st, 2017. So here on a really high level, the district has cash and investments of just over $17.3 million. There's total financial assets, so cash, investments, receivables, of $21,696,000. That is up from the prior year of 16.9. Long-term debt is being paid down on schedule, so it's now at $7.6 million. It was 8.8 last year, so a significant $1.2 million being paid down there. Total liabilities at the end of the year, $23,587,000. That is up from the prior year's number. However, a significant amount of that is in deferred revenue and development cost charges that are put aside for work to be done in the future or future capital projects. So then we get what we call a net debt position. We take the total financial assets, we subtract off the liabilities, sort of to look at kind of a liquid position. The net debt is $1,890,449. That is an improvement from the number last year, which was $3.5 million of net debt. The physical assets at the end of the year were accounted for at $148,523,000. It's down slightly from the prior year. We depreciate those assets to recognize the use of those assets. So that is your infrastructure, buildings, roads, water, sewer, that type of thing. That's the historic cost of those pieces of infrastructure. That's not a replacement cost. That's just what it cost when it was built, and then we depreciate it over time. And the accumulated surplus at the end of all that is $146,772,000. I will get into what's in that number in a future slide to show the breakdown of what's in there. So that gives you an idea of what was in the accounts at the end of the year. The next thing we want to look at is what happened during the year. We want to look at the statement of operations, what we used to call the income statement. So here we can see that total revenues for the year were $16,288,000. That's up from the $13.8 million of the prior year. Significant increases. The tax revenue is up just over $1 million, and the revenue coming through from the community forest, which the district is a shareholder in, is up $650,000 from the prior year. Total expenses were $16.7 million, not a significant change from the prior year, very consistent with what the expenses were. So the annual deficit on an accounting basis was $488,000, which is again an improvement from the prior year, which was a deficit of $2.2 million. I'm going to break up the income statement a little bit differently so you can see it in a different way here. So this slide is showing your revenues. I'm really showing you those first three, the blue, red, and green lines there. Property taxes being the largest source of funding for the district, followed by sale of goods and services, and the license, permits, and fee revenue. And some little bits of income coming from the other areas. Then looking to the expense side, you can see here the top three areas being the infrastructure maintenance, so the cost going into maintaining the systems that the district is managing. That's the green line. The blue one, administration and general government, is the next highest, followed by protective services. So that's not uncommon for us to see that type of breakdown in a municipality. So those are income statement numbers. There are lots of accountants adjustments to get to those. I like to look then at what happened with the cash flows because that's what you budgeted against, and that's what actually tells us what happened in the main cash accounts. So operations of the district brought in $6.5 million. Capital purchases, physical assets were $1.6 million. There's 38,000 net transferred into some investment accounts. As I mentioned, just shy of 1.2 million to pay down debt on schedule. So the net cash inflow at the end of the year was 3.6 million. Now in that number, there are some funds put aside and deferred for projects that are coming in 2018 and future years. I promised I'd mention or get into what's in that accumulated surplus figure of 146 million. So the amounts invested in capital assets is 140,816,000. So that is physical value, not cash value. The general fund has a surplus of $2.4 million in it. Sewer fund also has a $2.4 million surplus. And there's just over $1 million put aside in statutory reserves for future capital projects and other things that have been restricted by bylaw and council motions. I'll touch briefly on reserves. So reserves as a percentage of your physical assets, that should actually say 0.7%. There's a typo there with our decimal points. So less than 1% of your asset values is set aside as reserves for future capital and future capital replacement. So I would just have a couple items to consider, things for council to think about is future capital needs. This is kind of getting towards the asset management idea that we're seeing cost of construction increases anywhere in the 6 to 7% annually. So to get to an asset management plan, we often look at what the condition those assets are in, what's the anticipated replacement timeline, and then that can feed into what's the appropriate reserve level, because you really have to know when does that building need to be replaced, what year, how much do I need to save up for it to get there, and also how am I going to fund that? Is it going to be reserves, or is it going to be grants or debt? So there's a lot of moving pieces there, but that's something to consider with the current level of reserves at under 1% of the asset value. So that's everything that I have on the financial statements themselves. I'm happy to take a pause here to talk about the statements or answer any questions before I move into some of our audit findings.
Thank you. Any questions from council at this point? Councillor Noel Mueller.
Yes, thank you. If we could go back one slide, or maybe it's two to this one. So we depreciate our capital assets on a straight line depreciation. Is that correct? That's what was used?
That's correct.
Okay. And this is something that I've touched on in a number of years, but this kind of seems to me like one of the core pieces of our financial picture is the depreciation on those capital assets and how that affects our overall asset base. Do you have any comments about the risk inherent in that?
Yeah, and really what it comes down to from my perspective is the age of those assets as well, because that's all tied into a lot of those things would be quite depreciated for a long time. There's some older assets. The level of depreciation, or the speed at which things are being depreciated, is consistent with what virtually all municipalities do across the province. So I don't have any concern about whether things are being accelerated or too slowly depreciated. But that value is important to look at in the big picture of asset management. And I'll get to it in some of the, one of my slides later on around analysis. We'll talk about what's the rough age of those assets to feed into that when does it need to be replaced type of discussion. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments at this stage? We're good? Thank you, Corey. Continue.
Okay. So our draft audit report is included in one of the documents you have in front of you. We are happy to provide what we call an unqualified opinion. So that is auditor speak for a clean audit opinion. We're satisfied the statements are not materially misstated. We are prepared and ready to sign our report after, I should say, council approval tonight. Our auditor responsibilities with respect to the audit that is now complete, we look at the controls in place at the district to make sure that they are generating reliable financial information. So we get an understanding of them. We look at if there's any concerns that we have. We don't specifically test the effectiveness of those controls, but we do look at the design and implementation. We sample transactions throughout the year. It's not economically feasible for us to look at everything. And we would also have to be here all year, which I don't think staff would appreciate. So again, there's a repeat that the audit is complete. We are ready to sign off. The materiality we used in our audit was $450,000. So the materiality figure does a couple things. It drives our audit work. We look at every transaction over that 450,000 mark. We sample underneath. If we find an error or we find a difference, if it's over $450,000, we need it adjusted to be able to give you that clean audit opinion. If there are amounts that are under that, we discuss with staff. We say, do you want to make this change? Do you want to leave it on as an unadjusted? So we're comfortable that all the items, there aren't many that may have been left, are immaterial to the financial statements, and we're giving you a clean audit opinion. There were no limitations placed on the performance of our audit. We had access to all the documents we wanted to see, all the people we wanted to talk to. So thank you to staff for the time and effort of working with us this year. We didn't find any irregularities that would materially impact the statements, no evidence of conflict of interest, unusual related party transactions, illegal or questionable payments. We are not specifically fraud investigators, but if something comes to our attention, we have to follow it up. We have to bring it to your attention. So I'm happy to say that there's nothing for us to report to you tonight. During the audit, we have lots of discussions with specifically, first and foremost, with finance management and staff, but also management in the other departments. We would like to formally acknowledge their cooperation and assistance tonight. And I added one slide in here on things coming down the pipeline, future accounting changes. So next year, there are 6 new accounting standards coming in these various sections, related party disclosures, assets, a few other things. I do not anticipate a significant change to your statements as a result of these. A lot of these are just the standard setters sitting in Toronto, putting a bunch of stuff in to kind of tighten up some of the accounting rules, or they're putting in things for transactions like restructuring that you probably won't see. And if you do see it, they're very rare. There are changes coming. You might see some new disclosures, but you won't see changes to your numbers next year. So I will confirm that MMP is independent of the district. We did one other project with the district this year. We had an IT team come in and spend some time with the finance department, and I believe they've already reported out. That team was kept separate from our audit team, so that's the way we make sure you have an independent audit opinion. There's no crossover in those teams, no communication. In fact, I didn't see any of that report till you saw it. So that's how we make sure that we have that those safeguards in place. I'll pause. Are there any questions on our audit approach or audit findings before I finish off with some financial analysis?
I don't think there'd be any questions from council, but there might be one from the general public. And I'll go back to your slide on the draft audit report, and you mentioned it again in the audit findings that it's a clean audit, but you won't approve it until council's approved it. Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of engineering reports, consultants reports, and now an audit report that says it's draft, but as soon as council looks at it and approves it, often people are saying, oh, so what do you change and what do you do before it's approved? And you could just take us through that so people know that we're not actually asking for any changes in the audit or adjustments.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Our audit rules, again, set up with Standard Citizen Toronto, require 3 things to be done before we can finally sign off. The statements have to be complete and in an unchanged format. There's no changes coming tonight is what we anticipate. All of our work has to be done all the way through to our final quality control, and the governing body, being Mayor and Council tonight, has to formally approve. So from what you see in your reports and what the public has available, we don't anticipate any changes. If a change was to come out of the conversation tonight, we would go back to the drawing table, we would do some work and come back again with a final set. We wouldn't be able to, on the fly, adapt and adjust. It's just kind of a quirk of the auditing standards.
No, thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I will wrap up then with some financial analysis. So as I mentioned earlier, we like to look at some history, the last 3 to 5 years, to see where are the numbers trending. I might give you an idea of the types of things that are happening. So we look at 3 areas. We look at sustainability, flexibility, and vulnerability. So the first area being sustainability, the degree that the district can maintain its existing liabilities and financial obligations, both with respect to creditors, Municipal Finance Authority and other places where you'd owe money, and the service levels to the public, without changing the debt or tax burden. So we first start by looking at the total assets compared to the liabilities. This shows us how much has been financed with debt. So this ratio is greater than 7. It's consistently in a range from about 7.2 to 8.19 for the last few years. So the district has more assets than debt. And you can see that a lot of that, as we mentioned, was in that $140 million of physical assets. Right? So then we like to narrow in to look at the financial assets. Where are the liquid assets, the cash, investments, receivables, things that will turn over our cash or will become cash in the next year, and compare that to the liabilities that are coming due. So here's where we're looking at this magic number of 1. If the ratio is higher than 1, it means you have funds available right now to pay for future projects. If the ratio is below 1, it means you are taxing or incurring debt and grants to pay for the past, either past service or past capital projects. So the financial assets to liabilities ratio at the district has been fluctuating around 0.9 for the last few years. So this does suggest future revenues being required to pay for some past transactions. The ratio is getting better as we see the net debt come down, but it is still below that mark of 1.
Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. So what question I have on this is, what is a typical ratio that you generally see? Sorry, frog in my throat. And it begs a question actually at this table, I think, in that we typically borrow for capital assets that will have a longer lifespan so that those actually reaping the benefits of those assets are paying for them. So going forward, they would actually pay for that. But what you're saying here is that we should build up revenues to actually pay for those assets. So can you expand on that a bit?
So thank you, Councillor. I'll answer the sort of the 2 parts of the first part being what am I seeing with other municipalities. I'm seeing a lot of municipalities hovering just above the 1 mark, most of them with some fairly large capital projects in the pipeline, whether it's a waste water treatment plant or a water treatment plant, other like those big capital things coming. And so we're anticipating as borrowing for some of those facilities is in the tens of millions of range, that those will start to climb down, or those ratios will drop below 1, where you will be taxing or debt funding some of those items. To the second part, the kind of the where should you be, what's the mix? I would kind of point again to the asset management plan and the looking to the future of you can build it with grant, debt, or tax money, or user pay fees as well. But then the operating costs will be there, and the maintenance and replacement costs will be there. So it is a policy choice and a council decision of where to shift the burden. With respect to debt, falls on the future taxpayers, and grant funding and taxes fall on the taxpayers now, right? Or user pay, which would be more tightly linked to the actual users. Recognizing that you can't always get to user pay with some of the types of assets you're building. So there's no perfect answer for that, but it's got to be what level of debt is the district willing to take on, and how much to put on the future generations.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the question.
Thank you. So the next area that I will look at is flexibility. So the degree that the district might be able to change debt or tax burden on the district to meet existing obligations. And here we look at the age of the assets. So the carrying value or the depreciated value of the capital assets, and we compare that to the original cost. So it's declined from 76.5% in 2014 to 71.8% in 2017. So this is reflecting increase in costs, and that decline in ratio could impair some of the flexibility in the future as the capital needs really start to become high and present. That ratio in that 70 mark, when you compare it to some other communities that I work with, is not in a bad position. I've got some communities in the 50 to 60% range with some incredibly aging roads and sewer infrastructure. But I would caution against saying you're in good shape at 71.8 because you're declining, and you want to look at the costs are going up and up. As I mentioned, 6 to 7% on construction indexes for residential, never mind what industrial and infrastructure spend might be. And the,
Oh, sorry, we
Sorry,
just
go
thought
ahead.
there we have another question. I was just thinking that's exactly what we found with the last tender for sewage in West Sechelt. The costs are way more than 6 and 7%.
yes,
Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. So just to clarify on this, what you're saying is the lower that percentage is the older our assets are?
yes. As that
Okay,
declines, the age of the asset is declining.
And so the more we would need to have in reserves or to
Yeah,
potentially.
or your future costs are rising, yeah.
Thank you.
So if that number's going down and the previous number, the 0.9, is dropping, you're in really bad shape.
Yes. Less flexibility and less
Less
sustainability,
sustainability.
yes,
Which brings us to vulnerability.
yes, exactly. So it brings us to vulnerability, which is where if you don't have that ability to debt or tax or to shift those levels, you're looking to federal government funding and other funding bodies. So this often fluctuates with capital spend. Sometimes we see years with big capital projects, lots of government funding in place, either whether the district decided to do it or whether the federal government has pots of money in Infrastructure Canada and Build Canada and things like those. So this has fluctuated as high as 42% I'm not sure which year it was in the last 5 years, but 2017 was 7%, which is consistent with 2016 and 2015. So what that says to me is not a lot of large capital projects being federally funded at this point or grant funded. That for all communities that I work with, that is the name of the game. Those big projects need some chunk of federal funding because they're often too big to handle without it. So thank you for the opportunity to present to you tonight, and I'm happy we can unwind back. Sorry, Councillor, I moved too fast.
And Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. So under the vulnerability one, so we went from 42% to 7%. So as we take on big capital projects, we could actually see that percentage go up and down depending on the grant. So we've got some big sewer projects coming up. So we would see that move up from the 7%. Okay.
Yeah. Looking at the past with this ratio, sometimes it doesn't tell you a whole lot other than the fact that I might be able to pinpoint a year where I had a lot of large capital, but the 6 to 7% you've had in the last few years is low for historically what you've been doing.
And I would remind Council that we also brought forward item 10.1, which is pages 194 to 249, which is the actual draft consolidated financial statements. But first, we'll see if there's any questions right now for Corey. And if not, I'll turn to Ben to see if he'd like to say a few words about the financial statements so we can approve them as well. Mr. Curry's our finance manager of finances.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just one thing I'd like to highlight, excuse me, that we like to talk about with wrapping up the year, and that's where we finished with the general and sewer fund, and it gets missed in the statements. The general operating surplus from 2017 was $665,000, and the general surplus reserve from a deficit of $495,000 to a surplus of $170,000. It was expected through the later part of the year, and we're happy with where it finished due to some overages in revenue being made up from the building permit revenue and also service agreement revenue through engineering services from development in the community. In addition, the sewer fund operating surplus was $125,000, and the results strengthened the district's non-stat reserve balances by $561,000 or 12.8%. So this was an unexpected and non-budgeted surplus, which we finished the year end. So that was just a highlight that we wanted to point out. It's can be found in the statements on note 20 or on page 27 for where this is included and not necessarily discussed in the audit findings. And that's all we wanted to bring forward. If there's any other questions for staff.
I'm sure there'll be some questions, so don't go very far away.
Thank you.
And Just to remind council, this is on page one, what starts on 198 of our agenda. The auditor's letter with the unqualified opinion is page 200 of the agenda package, page 2 of the report. And we have also a recommendation from the manager, financial services, that we should need to pass before we finish is that the district's consolidated financial statements be approved. So I don't want to lose that. Are there any questions that we can go to at this point? Councillor Seegers?
Thank you. On page 214. I noticed the allowance for doubtful accounts, 617,000, that's 21%. I'm wondering if you can shed some light on that. It seems a little high.
That's page 15 of your report and
Page 15 of the report, yes, page 214. And
I'm just going to refer this to the Director of Financial Services, Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Your Worship. What this account is for accounts or receivables that we think may be unlikely to collect, so we've written them off, but we don't want to lose them because we still intend to attempt to collect them. So a lot have to do with the work that was done up at Sea-Watch and trying to deal with Concordia on those, but due to what's been going on, they've been held in abeyance at this point.
So while we're on that page, though, it shows that DCC's receivables went from 0 in 2016 to almost $1 million in 2017. Is there a particular reason why DCCs are not coming through?
These are actually for larger DCC projects when any development where the DCC charges over $50,000, the developer can choose to pay in 3 installments. Okay. They pay 1/3 up front and then 1/3 a year later and the 3rd installment second year. So this actually indicates that DCC revenue has been coming in at a greater pace, and this is the 2/3 that's being held.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Seegers.
thank you. Page 20 or page 219, whichever. Under capital at the bottom, it talks about grants and contributions were $2,900,000. That's what was budgeted, but we actually only recorded $140,000. Could you explain the discrepancy, or why we only took that much in?
I can answer that one as well, Your Worship. That is primarily the grants for the sewer treatment plant or the sewer expansion that's being done. Because they're conditional grants, we don't actually recognize the revenue until we spend the money, because if we don't spend the money, we'd have to give it back. So we've received about $900,000 from the federal government, but it's actually sitting in deferred revenue right now. Until such time as it's spent, then we'll recognize the revenue and the expenditure in the same year.
Okay, and can I explain to the community that one of the reasons for that is when we went out for tender on the expansion and the extension of the pipes into West Sechelt, the tenders came in way above expectations, and that slowed the process down. So the grants had come in, but we actually didn't have the tendering process or an affordable one. So that took almost 3 to 4 months to go through and retender them and bite off what we could actually manage that year. And Councillor Seegers.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to page 202, or this was in Consolidated Statement of Operations.
Yeah.
I wanted to point out the deficiency of revenues over expenses at $783,000. If we compare that to what the budget was or what it was in 2016, we've actually moved quite substantially. So that's a credit to our finance department. And again, on page 204, our net financial debt at the end of the year has reduced quite substantially. So again, comments and kudos to finance. That's all I have. Thank you.
The last one you mentioned on page 5 of the report, page 204 of the agenda, is significant, almost $5 million from budgeting down. Do you want to explain that? Because it's a pretty big number. Something we didn't actually go through with, obviously.
No, that really has to do with us. Certainly the change from 2016 to 2017 was not funding operations from reserves. So we weren't drawing down our cash reserves to fund our regular operations. And then the fact that we did actually generate a surplus for the year, which is offsetting the depreciation. side of things. So it's with that net or annual surplus deficit of 480,000, it's actually a combination of reduced capital equity, but a positive operating surplus.
And that's because of the financial sustainability plan?
That's the start of it,
really
by
the
certainly
start of
by not using reserves to fund our general operations.
Actually funding general operating with income that's coming in. Any other questions? Councillor Inkster, thank you.
I think I beat him.
Okay,
He sometimes uses his mic with his
Councillor
hand,
Mueller
so.
will be recognized first, sorry.
Yeah, it's just a comment and a thank you to staff. I know that there's been a lot of initiatives that you've put into place in this last year to keep these numbers on the up and up, and I see it, and I'm very pleased by it. The community at large doesn't really know the amount that's been going on in the finance department, and I hope we find the ways to let them know, but we're in the midst of a financial sustainability plan, and that's one of the reasons why these numbers are getting better. It's because of their concerted effort, the staff here, that this has been possible, and I look forward to what you come up with next. Thanks.
Thank you for that, and Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, thank you. I too am impressed with the improving health of the financials. Mr. Curry, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, your piece, that there was a note in the financials that indicated an additional surplus that was in the notes. If you could point that out to me, I'm always interested in surprise revenue and or surplus amounts that are accruing to the district.
Absolutely. It's note 20 on page 27 of the statements. And do you want to get there and take a look at it?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So you'll see on the second column there on the non-statutory reserves, under the general fund prior year surplus, where it was a deficit of 495,000 in the prior year. And you see the contribution of 665,000, which is our transfer from surplus for general operating throughout the year, which brings it to a positive balance of 170,000. The same for the sewer fund on the bottom line of 1.2 million in 2016, and the contribution is actually is offset, so it's not quite as clear. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong line. The second last line, the 1.259, and you see the contribution of 125,000, bringing a final balance of 1.279, and the 104,000 would be funding capital throughout the year.
Is that helpful?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that as well. Anything else from council before we make the motion to approve? Seeing nothing else from council, I'll look for someone to make the motion that the district's 2017 consolidated financial statements be approved. Thank you, Councillor Mueller, seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you to MNP, Corey and Associates, for your work, and Ben and Doug, Manager and Director, thank you very much for your work on this as well. Appreciate it. Okay, we're moving back to the regular order of the agenda, the item 5, which would be the adoption of minutes of the previous council meetings. And I would look for a motion to receive, thank you, and adopt, second by Councillor Lutz. Any errors or omissions in those minutes? Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. Page 29, recommendation number 6. The way the minutes are written here, it indicates that this was carried. My recollection of that was that it was actually defeated.
Corporate Officer Frank. And microphone.
Thank you. Yes, it was brought to my attention moments before the meeting started that that is a typo. Recommendation number 6 on page 29 of the agenda. That recommendation was actually defeated by the Finance Committee at its March 21st meeting. It should not have been cut, pasted, and included in the minutes. So I would ask that the minutes be amended and remove that.
One amendment we require. Any other errors or omissions?
No,
and
thank you.
Councillor Seegers? No others? with the amendment to delete item 6 on the top of page 29, page 3 of the agenda minutes. All those in favor of adoption? Any opposed? That's carried. And then we move to minutes from committee meetings, and we start with the committee minutes of the Planning and Community Development meeting. And this was a very busy Planning Committee meeting, and we want to make sure we're aware of everything we're passing. First, a motion to receive. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? And are there any items here we'd like to pull out for further discussion or clarification? Councillor Wright?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd like to pull 2 recommendations, number 13 and 14. That's the Van Key development.
Okay. And we will be moving on to the Wade one. We'll be looking at later so we can see how that is discussed. Any others that need to be pulled out for this moment? Looking just at those 2 then, can I look for a motion to adopt recommendations number 2 through 13? Sorry, 3 to 12, and 15 to 20. Thank you, Councillor Mueller, Chair of the committee, seconded by Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? That's carried. And we can go back to the items, page 13 and 14, which was the Van Key development issues. And Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't have anything particular against this development. However, I've been getting a lot of emails and phone calls about this development, and it appears that there's some concern over what's happening with this development, and the public doesn't know it, what's going on. So I would like to just have a quick explanation, 5 minutes or so. And I did speak to the Director of Planning and Development and warn her that this was coming. I believe there are probably people in the audience this evening who would like to have that explanation. And if we could just do that for their benefit, they would appreciate it. Those also watching on YouTube will probably appreciate it as well. Thank you.
And for those of us who don't attend Planning Committee would appreciate it. So Director Corbett or Community Planner Thompson? Okay. Mr. Thompson, just a brief background on this development and how it's come to us tonight.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. So this proposal from Van Key is for a 66-lot subdivision in the Selma Park neighborhood. So this is a large development lot in between Havies Road and Nessman Road. And it the property has been zoned R1 for, as far as I can tell, since the district's inception. It's been kind of slated for this residential development for a very long time. So what this proposal seeks to do is have these 66 lots. A lot of it is, I actually do have my presentation from the Planning Committee, which might have some useful visuals, if I could pull that up.
If we can find it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There we are.
So I'll kind of just skip to some of the visuals that might help. So here you can see the property in between Havies and Nessman Road. It's about 10.5 hectares, I do believe. Some of the background information. The property is within development permit areas 2 and 5, and that's part of the application coming forward, those development permits in there. However, for the most part, the development staying out, the proposed residential development is staying outside of that, outside of the major hazard areas. And of course, the development variance permit is to seek some variances to the servicing standards. So kind of just talking a little bit more about the development here, here you can see the proposal. So you can see the 66 lots. They're quite large lots. They're about 1,000 square meters each on average. There are a few smaller ones towards kind of the fringes and where they're a bit more oddly shaped. You can see here, you can see Laurel Road continuing up through here, Nessman Road here, continuation of Betty Road here. as well as the internal road network going around here. So as part of this, to actually achieve this density, they are also looking at bringing sewer to this property. And that would be running a sewer line from this property all the way essentially to downtown Sechelt along Highway 101. I have been speaking with our engineering department about some of the details about that. I've also heard some concerns, and I've spoken to some nearby residents about potential disruptions or anything like that. They are looking at, subject to all these approvals, starting construction in the fall and finishing before the end of the year. They're trying to keep some of these construction disruptions to a minimum by doing lateral drilling for a large portion of the pipes. So there wouldn't be a lot of delays on the highway. So I wanted to make sure to kind of alleviate some of those concerns. If there's any other questions council has about the development.
No, thank you very much for that. And I'll just ask the planning chair to say a few comments about the discussion at planning. And Councillor Mueller is chair of planning.
Yeah, this one, because of the type of application it is, has a little bit less in terms of public notification and public input. We've seen a number of these come forward in the last year, which are more or less fitting with the existing plan in terms of existing zoning and to fit with the overall vision of the way development's going in Sechelt, which is infill housing of already existing zoning near infrastructure. But I did have a question though, was about at what point in the process we're going to hear a little bit more about the plans for sewer.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes, Your Worship. So they would be, currently they're still in the exploratory stages. You may have seen them out doing some test pits, test holes and everything, looking at that. So once we kind of get a lot more closer to that stage, there will have to be a latecomers agreement, and that's going to be one of the kind of primary financial things that will have to come to council. And that is for the cost recovery for the developer, essentially upfronting this quite large cost to bring the sewer line all the way here, all the way to this property. So that is something that will be coming forward to council. Other than that, I'm not quite sure. Maybe I can ask the Director of Finance about any other sewer service area concerns or not. I'm not too familiar with that, but I believe that may also come to council.
There is a liquid waste management plan that's under review, and that will also discuss the aggregate sewage in that area at that time. But, anything to add, Mr. Stewart? Who's on the spot?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, the only other area that's going to have to come into play is looking at the sewer service area to ensure that these areas are billed sewer services accordingly.
Yep. Good. And
we would expect all that to come through engineering, I assume, and be dealt with by members of the planning committee at regular council at some point in the future.
Members of the Public Works Committee. Sorry.
That would be my assumption, that the Public Works will be dealing with the actual project itself and the logistics behind it, and probably coming through the planning committee, and then probably the finance committee to deal with the billing side of things.
Thank you.
And Councillor Inkster, thank you for being patient.
Yeah, no problem. I as well did receive questions on this and did look into it, and it's interesting that it's a subdivision and/or development that's went through a number of proposals and/or iterations over a number of years. It will create that access road that we've been looking for through that area to join up the Laurel to Nessman that we've been talking about over a number of years once it is complete. But what it will also do, though, is create some traffic pattern changes. We're not sure, I can't determine because I've not seen where the sales will necessarily occur. So I'm not sure if it's a local sale. So it's local sales, so that may mean that the traffic patterns aren't as predictable as we may assume based on local sales of these homes. So we may have a different traffic pattern, but also too, my questions would be, is the bottom of Havies and Nessman, once it comes out, how they enter the highway system and how they proceed down Nessman, will there be, I'm assuming there'll be road improvements that we will request, and that we will work with MOTI at either of those two roads to look at maybe widening and/or potentially a left lane if there's a lot of traffic coming down. So those are the kinds of questions I had of planning when this number of lots is proposed to go in so quickly in this area.
Well, as you say, it's been off and on for well more than a decade.
Yes.
So it's nice to see it. Developers working very well with staff, as you can tell, if we're talking about road improvements and a sewer line going from there all the way into the, it's really, everything I've heard has been very positive. And just to say, every built residence is a local home. They're local. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. I'd like staff to comment on the variance that's been requested with, to do with bike paths and roads, etc. Thank you.
And Mr. Thompson.
Yes. Thank you, Your Worship. So there were several variances requested, and I've kind of color coded them here. So you can see there's a variance to the road standards along Laurel and Nessman. That's to vary the collector road standard. There's a variance along Betty Road to vary the half road standard. A variance that they requested for the Havies Road to vary that standard, as well as the internal road network. And then finally, a variance to eliminate essentially the requirement to do a road and instead do a pedestrian pathway to connect to the Chapman Creek Trail network. Yes.
I think that's, go ahead.
So I do have some of the cross sections here that kind of try to highlight those proposed variances. So with the Laurel Road and Nessman Road variances, they're looking at a more modern collector road standard. This is a standard that's not in our bylaw 430, but as kind of the more up-to-date engineering practices. So this looks at, instead of having an 11-meter wide road that has shared vehicle traffic and cyclist traffic, you actually separate the cyclist traffic away from that and instead have a shared multi-use pathway with pedestrians and cyclists sharing that way and having separated from the vehicle traffic. So you can see that proposed variance, and that was of course endorsed by the planning committee as well. The proposed variance on Havies Road was that they want to actually eliminate the need for doing a boulevard, which would separate the sidewalk from the curb and the vehicle travel lanes. This wasn't supported by staff and wasn't endorsed by planning committee, but it was a part of the requested variance. And that was the same kind of thing that they were hoping to do with the unnamed roads, the internal road network, again, eliminating the boulevard, but it wasn't supported by staff and was not endorsed by committee. With Betty Road, they're actually looking at doing a little bit more wider half road standard than was in a typical standard. Our typical standard is 4.8 meters, but they wanted to do 5.5 meters, and there was no issue. There was enough room to support that, so staff recommended, and that was endorsed by the planning committee. And then I didn't have a cross section for this, but then the final variance was they looking at that eliminating the requirement for doing that road along on Nessman Road north of the east of the intersection with Laurel Road, and instead doing that pedestrian connection along this, instead of having a road that would essentially lead to the edge of the ravine, have that just instead that pedestrian connection. So
That's very good. And Councillor Seegers has a follow-up.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, and this is what you presented to committee, the variances are actually not to lessen the requirements of the developer with regards to road structures. It's actually to raise the standard so that we actually have separated bike lanes and pedestrian lanes rather than on or in conjunction with the road itself.
Essentially, it's a little bit of a reallocation and changing the standard, but it's not diminishing the standard.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for that explanation, and thank you for those questions to show, again, how we try and work to modify when we don't have the right. We still have a pretty old zoning and subdivision. But Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship, and Council, thank you for indulging me. I know that some of the people in the audience are very interested in what this particular project is doing, and it's sat dormant for a number of years, so there's, all of a sudden, things start to happen, and there's been no reports on it that they've seen. So I appreciate it. I know we have a lengthy agenda, so thank you.
Thank you, but I don't want to forget that we need to move recommendations 13 and 14. Thank you, Councillor Mueller, and Councillor Wright will let you second those ones. All those in favor? That's carried, and those are moved forward. Did I get them both, or did I miss one?
No, sorry. Thank you, Mayor and Council. One thing I did want to mention regarding this, we have run into some issues, and we will probably continue to run into issues in these kind of circumstances where something has been zoned or was approved quite some time ago. Quite some time passes and then it shows up. And in some of our processes, if we're doing development permit and subdivision, the public doesn't see it. The only reason they got notification is on the variance. So I'm going to be working with our communications manager, and we're going to look at a way to put something out there of kind of what's happening in my neighborhood so people are not surprised by this. So we'll do that on a monthly basis. And organize it by neighborhood so that people get a heads up on where things are at.
Thank you. And these properties do sometimes, in the 1980s, we called that the teacher's property because there was 5 teachers that owned it, and they bought it for speculation and investment purposes. And we thought it would never, ever, ever, ever be developed. But eventually somebody came along and the times have changed, and now it's almost, not quite 40 years. So thank you, everyone, for taking us through that, for those of us who didn't attend the Planning Committee. Moving on then to 7.2, which is the minutes of the Public Works, Parks and Environment, and a motion to receive and adopt. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Councillor Inkster as chair. Any errors or omissions in those?
There is none, but I would ask that after these are passed, that I would ask for an additional motion to originate from those minutes.
Okay, so can we have a motion to adopt the recommendations from Wednesday, March 28th. Thank you, and thank you. Second, all those in favor? That's carried. And Councillor Inkster.
Based on the discussion at the meeting.
Microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Based on the discussion at the meeting and that I requested a staff member to draft a potential motion to come forward, it is in the minutes, and I will introduce the committee request a report outlining the initial budgeted operating costs of the Water Resource Center in comparison to the current operating costs.
Oh, okay, that's on page 46 under item 7.1. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Seegers. Council requesting a report outlining the initial budgeted operating costs of the Water Resource Center in comparison to the current operating costs. Can that go to the committee and not back to council? Sure. Okay with that? Good.
Yes, there was some discussion at, actually the chair brought that up in discussion, and then committee members, we thought it was a good idea. And so I don't mind it coming back to committee, and then I hope it then has some discussion, and then as normally happens, hopefully it comes back to council. Yeah. I will actually request in this particular case that the information does come to council. In some reports, the background information, such as in planning, doesn't always come forward to council. So I will request once it comes to us that it does come forward to council as well.
It's a motion to council, so it'll end up here.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure it could go to you for further discussion.
Yeah.
We know what we're voting on? Request for a report. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you for that. And then we move to item 7.3. It's 8 o'clock. Minutes of the Finance, Culture, and Economic Development Committee, and I do have an amendment on these as well. But first, a motion to receive and adopt. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Councillor Lutz. I would ask you to turn to page 51 of our agenda, page 5 of the report, recommendation number 11. There's some slight rewording in that motion compared to what was spoken at the night. So it should read that the District of Sechelt confirms our agreement to work with the Sechelt Nation and the Community Reconciliation Working Group to complete. So striking out "it is in," so it confirms our agreement, or if it's a District of Sechelt, its agreement, but the District of Sechelt confirms our agreement to work with the Sechelt Nation and the Community Reconciliation Group to complete. And with that, amendment put in before we vote. Can I have a motion to adopt recommendations 2 through to 13? Thank you, Councillor Wright. Councillor Seegers seconding. All those in favor? That's carried. Moving on to item 8 for 3 readings. Mr. Curry's left. Parks, Lands and Roads temporary rental. Oh yes, thank you for reminding us there's a potential conflict of interest, and Councillor Mueller will get a short break. I was going to break at 8:30 and I wondered why he was leaving early. So we'll try and make it through to 8:30. Okay, now, first a motion to receive the report. Thank you, and that's seconded by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? It's before us. He's not here. Would you like to speak to it? Director Stewart.
Thank you, Your Worship. So, yes, this report is to outline the process and the series of meetings that have occurred at the Finance, Culture, and Economic Development Committee in regards to amending this bylaw. It started in February, really looking at just adding the Trail Bay site. We were asked to use some public consultation, particularly with the Chamber of Commerce and the Seashell Downtown Business Association. Both those groups endorsed this idea and liked the thought of having that third spot down here in Trail Avenue. Through another series of meetings, some other concerns were raised by the committee. We hope we've addressed them as we've gone through. So on page 54 is a summary of the amendments that we're proposing in the bylaw, essentially to add a mobile vending location in Friendship Park at the Trail Bay waterfront, to permit seasonal mobile vendors the ability to rotate between the established locations. The idea here is that if we have 3 food vendors, they can rotate among the 3 locations rather than having each one permanently located in one spot. It was to restrict the seasonal mobile vending to food services only, to limit the number of permits that we would issue to 4 at any given time. We did put a proposal that the variation for mobile food services be approved through council resolution. Now, the point of this is a twofold. One, should something come along that council may wish to allow, rather than having to change the bylaw, you can do it by resolution and accept it. And we do have one that we know of is coming. We have a non-food vendor looking to, or has approached us to use a spot at Davis Bay, which is actually a smaller spot, which really isn't appropriate for a food vendor anyway. They wouldn't be able to get a truck in there. So there will be a request to issue that company a permit coming once this bylaw is adopted in a few weeks. And finally, the last change was to provide an exemption to the bylaw to allow general mobile food vendors at parks, beaches, and school grounds during permitted special events. So this would be if a group takes out a special event permit for an area, they'd be allowed to bring in food vendors as well. This could be Oktoberfest, Canada Day, and other events that are perhaps down in this downtown core. So that's really the summary of the changes. The final recommendation here is that we seeking council's approval to start looking at a review of the entire bylaw. And as we've gone through this and through the discussion with the Finance Committee, it became evident that this bylaw is a little bit dated and does need some further work. So I want to assure council that really what we're looking at here is 3 food vendors rotating between 3 locations, a potential non-food vendor at one spot. That would be it for the 2018 season, and we would be bringing back a revised bylaw full review prior to the 2019 season.
Thank you very much for that report, and thank you for giving it to us again so we could read through it more carefully. I know we're not supposed to be anal and find little editing and typos and stuff, but I had to remark that the review proposed for 2019, you can tell Bennett, he said it could include public consolation. I'm hoping it'll be public celebration, but at least it will be consultation. So only if it fails will it be a public consolation. So that was on the final line of page 55. But it was helpful. I was able to go through and check, and then read the bylaw and see what was going on. So I appreciate that. If I could have any other discussion at this point or clarification from Mr. Stewart. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. Page 63, right at the bottom, H. I think I know what we're attempting to do with this. fresh fruit and vegetable vending, so, but it's saying, the way it reads is it almost comes across as the seasonal mobile vendors cannot provide fresh fruit or vegetables at their trucks. So I don't know how that wording fits what we're trying to do.
I think it was intentional so it wouldn't compete with the farmer's market, and that it
Right.
would, in fact, any fresh vegetables or fruit or strawberries would be processed at least by being repacked. So that it wouldn't say you couldn't sell an apple on the side of your hot dog stand, but it would be, wouldn't be a farmer's market apple. It
Right,
would be-
I understand that, but it says here, not allowable for fresh fruit or vegetable vending. So the mobile trucks cannot have fresh fruits or vegetables,
Permits are limited to food and beverage only,
and not
and the
allowable.
permits are not allowable for fresh fruit or vegetables.
So sorry?
It's not allowing for a standalone vending.
Okay. As long as we're clear, thank you.
That's what I tried to mean by just a little bit of processing on the way, but not a standalone, not a fruit stand as we normally know them. Councillor Inkster, sorry I didn't recognize you.
Yeah, that's fine. I hadn't put my hand up yet. I know in the interest of expediency and preparing for the season, I will vote to move it forward. I'm glad that there's one spot that will have alternative to food provision there, because as I mentioned previously, I was concerned that the rules and/or bylaw may be too narrow in the allowed uses. So we'll see in the revisions going to next year and allowing enough time for those revisions and introductions of new information and proposals, what staff comes up with and what we can work through in the next year to make sure that it serves our community with those spots better. Thanks.
And could I have somebody to move second and third recommendations on page 52? Thank you, Councillor Wright and Seegers. No further discussion. All those in favor? That's carried, and we will have mobile vendors for 2018. And moving then to the bylaw itself. And there was some amendments to the page numbering in that report in the next, so I hope people have been able to find it. The bylaw is on page 88, and it's before us for first, second, and third reading. This is a bylaw number 480-2, 2018, a bylaw to amend Parks, Lands, and Roads Temporary Rental Bylaw number 480, 2008. It's moved for reading a first time by Councillor Seegers and Councillor Lutz. All those in favor of first reading? That's carried. And second reading of the bylaw is moved by Councillor Seegers again and Councillor Shanks. Any discussion at second reading? All those in favor? That's carried. And third reading is moved by Councillor Seegers and Lutz, seconding. All those in favor of third reading? And those are carried unanimously. Thank you. If somebody could let Noel, Councillor Mueller, know that he's allowed to rejoin us for the road naming bylaw. No, he went outside, actually. He'd be locked.
He went between doors.
Yeah. Oh.
I'll move receipt.
Item 8.2A and receipt of the report on road naming has been moved by Councillor Lutz, seconded by Councillor Mueller as he sits down. All those in favor? And staff to speak to it. Director Corbett.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. What is before you is a road naming bylaw. We're asking for 3 readings of this bylaw. The purpose of it is to approve specific names for a number of places throughout the district. It's new development that needs to be named. It covers areas in West Porpoise Bay, East Porpoise Bay, downtown Sechelt. It should be West Sechelt, that is on page 95. It has West Porpoise Bay in twice, that's typo. And then in Selma Park, Davis Bay, that is the naming for the Van Key development. The other thing that this report is doing, in addition to the bylaw, is asking you to direct staff to revise and update the road naming policy. We want to clarify criteria, just bring in a little more detail as to how we do that.
Thank you very much.
That concludes. Thank you.
Do I I have somebody to move the second and third recommendations? Thank you, Councillor Shanks and Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? That's carried. And Councillor Seegers, as we move towards the bylaw.
Thank you. Could we have a little more clarification on recommendation number 3? Because you're recommending that we develop a new council policy.
Sorry, Your Worship, members of council. The existing policy is quite dated, and what we wanted to do is put a little more criteria in terms of how we approach the road naming, to build some of the factors in. There's some things that Canada Post want to see. There's some things that the regional district gets concerned about. It needs to pass the Amazon test. So a number of criteria around being unambiguous and the ability to read it. So it's just really clarifying those kind of things.
That's sufficient? Okay, thank you for that. And Councillor Inkster, we're heading towards the bylaw.
Yes, yes. As I mentioned before with road naming, and I'm not sure how it will be, this information and or idea will be applied, but I did mention last week, which is interesting that's come forward, is that I'd love to see, if possible, some she/shell names in some of the road names, especially those that have consideration of geographical feature and have some historical significance to the she/shell peoples. We should in probably small cases, especially in the downtown core, consider names that we work with the Seychelles to come from their language to denote a geographic feature. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Any further discussion of the report? I have 2 questions on the bylaw. I didn't actually recognize the names for Selma Park, Davis Bay, Wilson Creek, Whiteside, and Dolls. Are those surnames or goats? And they're indigenous to Selma Park, eh? Yeah, thanks for that intervention. And because I don't know, Director Corbett.
No, it's okay. She answered it.
Is that in fact correct? These are animals?
Let me get to that one. So in terms of the number 3 is the birds.
We understood
There's
that.
the vegetation. Those are dolphins.
Okay.
And the rest are crabs. So
Okay.
it's getting sea life. Thank you.
Dolphins. Okay, moving to item 8.2B, a bylaw number 564/2018, road naming, and I'd like somebody to move first reading. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Lutz. All those in favor of first reading? That's carried. And bylaw number 464/2018, road name is in a bylaw to name several new streets is introduced for second reading by Councillor Wright and Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? That's carried. And third reading is introduced by Councillor Seegers and Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? That's carried. I hope there's no intention to change existing, because you've decided in item 7 that roads will be named avenues if they run one way, streets if they run another way, ways if they terminate on the same road, place if it's short, but no road will be named a road. And I live on Davis Bay Road, and I'd like it to stay Davis Bay Road. Director Corbett.
Council, one of the things that we wanted to clarify actually in the policy was the difference between the criteria we'd use in new road names, but also the public process that would be involved if we were ever having to change existing roads. And the only reason we would kind of find that is where you're joining two and they've had different names or something like that. It's not an arbitrary process, but there would be more of a public engagement associated with that because it affects people, and with businesses it affects cost.
Okay. Davis Bay Street doesn't sound the same as Davis Bay Road, so wait till I'm in one of those new nursing homes before we change that. Item 8.3 is the 2018-22 financial plan, bylaw number 563, and 2018 tax rates. And first, a motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillor Wright and Councillor Seegers. All those in favor of receipt? And as the turn it to the director, of Corporate and Financial Services. And I'll just say that one thing we're attempting to do is have all reports standardized and look the same. And now we have 2 from Finance with different numbering and formatting. So we'll work on that. Director Stewart.
Thank you, Your Worship. So we're seeking tonight is to get 3 readings for 2 bylaws for the financial plan. One is the 2018-22 financial plan bylaw, and the other is the tax rate bylaw to set the property tax rates for 2018. I was thinking it's actually quite a small report considering this process started last August, really, with staff starting to put together budgets and us going through them, starting with the Finance Committee in December, multiple meetings with the Finance Committee, a public input meeting, several more meetings with the Finance Committee. I guess the culmination was on March 28th when a Finance Committee passed a resolution, was ultimately endorsed by Council, that a property tax rate increase of a total of 5.78%, with 3% being for infrastructure renewal as per the financial sustainability plan, and 2.78% being for operational needs, being endorsed and included in the 2018-22 financial plan. So that's what these bylaws achieve. We do project out for the 5 years, basically assuming the same level of service. I look at debt servicing based on capital. So the 4 years beyond are really just based on providing that same level of service. Obviously, every year Council scrutinizes it, and we'll be dealing with future years as they come along. So at this point, we're seeking 3 readings of both these bylaws. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of the report or the bylaws before we get to them? Councillor Mueller and then Councillor Seegers. They both come on. Councillor Mueller first.
It's okay. Every year when we get to the budget time, when it's the time to do the major bylaws, I always provide some comments on the budget. And I'd like to do that now, if that's okay with the chair.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank staff for working through this with us again. When it first came to our table, there was a large tax increase proposed, and that was difficult for council to work through. The tough part, though, is that our financial situation needs that type of difficult work, and our staff were brave enough to bring us something that actually does get to the heart of our Sechelt needs. And unfortunately, that is, these days, we need to have more money for capital, and that's what the asset renewal is in there, 3%. It hasn't been widely publicized, but we're trying to put that away each year to make sure that we can deal with their capital needs as they come up. In terms of future years, we're going to be working through this 5-year plan, but I would recommend to staff that in this year, we plan on doing this each year, and the tough part is going to be that we actually shift some of our services in some of those years to make that a little bit less on our population. We know we have to do this. It's a structural correction, and that's always difficult. But so I guess that would be my comments to staff, is that in the next year, we have to try to come up with some shifting, to try to shift some of our operations and some of the things we're doing to make that less. And other than that, I'm very happy with the budget.
Thank you for those comments, and I think we are thinking of a service review at some point. And Councillor Seegers, please.
Thank you. I have a question about page 111. Under sewer collection and treatment, just one of the items in there, additional membrane filters. I seem to recall that we had the membrane filters funded out of DCCs. It was a DCC cost. So here we've got it out of sewer reserve. So I'd like to have staff, go back and look at that piece. And then I'd like to also comment on page 112, the last item, reclaimed water treatment and distribution. Registered in there for 2022, assuming that we will get grants, et cetera. And I would anticipate that we would see some pre-work coming forward in one of those prior years to have us shelf ready so that when grants are available, we'll actually be ready to do something like that. There are some FCM grants coming out currently that we could potentially look at to do some of that pre-work. So we'll take those forward with staff. Thanks.
Thank you, and that's a good suggestion. If we want grants, we have to know what the designs are before we apply for them. Any other comments on the report or response? I was just going to comment on page 105 when we get to the actual bylaw. The 5-year plan shows a property tax increase of 8.19% next year. For anyone who is thinking of being on the next council, you better start working. I wasn't sure if you put that in because you might be able to get away with it after an election, or you wanted to scare off anyone of us who were thinking, or anyone in the community who might actually want to be on council. Just say, no, you're looking at an 8.19% increase. But I think that's what Councillor Mueller was speaking about. Let's start working on it now. Motion to adopt recommendations 2 and 3, which is 1.2 and 1.3 on page 102. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Lutz. All those in favor? That's carried. And then we do move item 8.3B, which is the 2018-22 financial plan bylaw with the comments that you heard in terms of getting ready for future years. First, this is a bylaw number 563-2018, a bylaw to adopt the financial plan for the years 2018 to 2022. And first reading is introduced by Councillor Wright and Councillor Seegers. All those in favor of first reading? None opposed? That's carried. Second reading is introduced Councillor Mueller and Councillor Lutz. Any discussion at second reading? Any amendments? All those in favor? That's carried. And third reading of bylaw number 563-2018 is moved by Councillor Wright. Councillor Shanks, thank you. All those in favor of third reading? Any opposed? That's carried. And that takes us all to 8.3C, which is 2018 tax rates bylaw number 565-2018, a bylaw for establishing tax rates for municipal, hospital, Sunshine Coast Regional District, and the Sunshine Coast Regional Recreation purposes for the year 2018. And that's page 115 and 116 with an attachment just after that. First reading is introduced by Councillor Seegers and seconded by Councillor Shanks. All those in favor of first reading? Any opposed? Second reading is introduced by Councillor Mueller and Councillor Wright. All those in favor? That's carried. And third reading is introduced by Councillor Shanks and Councillor Wright. All those in favor of third reading? That's carried, and those will come back for adoption at our next council meeting. For first reading, item 8.4. Let's see if we can get through this without a break, and then we might look for a 5-minute break. Thank you, Councillor Lutz, for moving receipt of the report from the community planner, and we look back to Mr. Thompson, who's got a busy night tonight.
Thank you, Your Worship. So this is follow-up based off of the recommendations coming from the Planning Committee for the Wade OCP amendment and zoning bylaw amendment. Just some of the background on the property, on the proposal. So this is this application affects 3 properties in the downtown neighborhood, located at the intersection of East Porpoise Bay Road and Wharf Avenue, as you can see here. So what the OCP amendment is seeking to do is to permit an increase in the maximum allowed density from 100 units per hectare to 114 units per hectare. And the rezoning is to change the zone from the R2 zone to a new comprehensive development zone 42 to allow for the construction of a 6-story mixed-use development, that's mainly residential, with 93 square meters of commercial space. So the current OCP designation is downtown center and multifamily mixed residential. The proposed zoning is CD42, and it's within the downtown development permit area. So some of the project details, the proposal is for 47 units. Its maximum height is 6 stories, and which is 19.62 meters. They're looking at a maximum lot coverage of 45%. Minimum setbacks from the current Wharf Avenue and East Porpoise Bay Road for 10 meters, and the minimum setbacks along the side roads and the internal sidelines is 6 meters. So here you can see a site plan that's looking at the dome. This is at the ground floor. So the commercial space is here in this kind of circular pavilion. There's a public plaza. And you can see the building, which is kind of offset rectangle. Here you can kind of, it's again, hard to see at this scale, but this does have the setback lines shown on it. So as part of this is actually underground parking, which has a bit different setbacks than the above ground building. Those are close to the lot lines, but they wouldn't be as noticeable as they are underground. Here you can kind of see a site profile. So this is what it would be looking like from the sides. You can see the 6 stories, a little bit of terracing back at the rear of the building, as well as you can see the kind of straight on view looking at the building. And here's a rendering of what the building could look like. This is if you're looking at it from the northwest corner of the intersection of East Forest Bay and Wharf. And this is if you were along Wharf Avenue, what it could look like. So we've done a technical review. The geotechnical report is something that is currently underway. The applicant has people on it, and it is scheduled. It will be completed prior to any public hearing. An archaeological report in a similar stance, it's being scheduled and will be completed prior to any public hearing. Water service is available. Sewer service is adequate capacity for the proposal. Storm sewer, again, available in adequate capacity. Roads and traffic, there has been a traffic impact study, and it didn't require any major upgrades or anything like that. Fire protection has been confirmed by the fire department that they have adequate capacity to service this building, as well as it will be sprinklered as part of the BC Building Code. In terms of some of the community fit aspects, this would be the tallest building in the area. However, the OCP does also look at supporting other redevelopment in the surrounding neighborhood could be of similar heights or at least higher than what's existing. Some of the kind of key concepts of how it aligns with the vision and policies of the OCP in terms of managed growth. This is as the downtown, this is the main priority growth area. The property is already serviced by a full range of services. It does meet a quite compact development. This is a walkable location, prevents sprawl and having to have further development into kind of more natural areas outside the core. And compact development just supports active transportation and transit. The downtown first kind of core principle, it does provide mixed use. It has a commercial space in it as well as the residential. It kind of provides a good transition because it isn't overwhelming commercial space, so it does provide that kind of transition between the kind of more predominantly residential neighborhood surrounding area and then congregating into the more downtown kind of core along Wharf Avenue. It also does seek to help to provide an increased range of housing options. Within the development, there is a large variation in unit sizes, about 800 square feet to about 1,800 square feet, with a different bedroom counts and everything. So on those as well as looking at just increasing our stock of multifamily units, which are lacking in Sechelt. And building green sustainably, there is a commitment as part of the density increase of building to a Build Green Gold or better standard. So as I discussed, some of the amenities providing the Build Green Gold standard, building the units to an adaptable or accessible standard, have 5 units of affordable housing or equivalent, and then also looking at increasing the supply, which helps the overall affordability within Sechelt. So the recommendations are that both the official community plan and the zoning bylaw amendments be given first reading. That council considers them in conjunction with the financial plan, the liquid waste management plan, the regional district solid waste management plan, and the registration of the wastewater treatment plan. And then finally, that staff be authorized to schedule a public hearing for both these bylaws. That would happen after we receive those archaeological and geotechnical reports as we previously discussed. And of course, the options are to adopt as presented, that the application be referred back to staff, or the application be denied. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that report. And I'll look to councillors for any clarifications while the community planner is with us, or initial discussion of the report before we go to the recommendations. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. Bottom of page 122. Last paragraph. I know that there were some concerns raised at the committee meeting regarding the height and the massing of the building. And it looks like you've gone back to the builder, developer, et cetera. And they're looking to prepare a view corridor analysis, which will be completed prior to the public hearing. So I'm assuming that will be presented at the public hearing?
Yes, through your worship. That is it could be presented as part of the public hearing. It would be available in the package leading up to it. So if anyone wants to come in and review it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the last sentence in here is, staff have discussed, methods of addressing the terracing, et cetera, building height with the applicant, and the applicant's willing to explore them based on public feedback. So that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Speaking with the applicant, there were some concerns with terracing about potential issues that have to be planned around that, such as like the leaky condo issue. The more terracing you have, that could be an issue. So that is something he has talked to his architect about, but is something we're discussing. So,
Councillor Inkster.
So I'm assuming based on the previous questions asked and the discussion that there may be a revision of the drawings and or the presentation given to council moving forward. That's interesting because it looks like there's a lot of work put into this one. So the height is a concern. There's a number of issues as we go forward. I'd like to hear what the community has to think about this, but the issues that I have going forward is when we look at the density in the downtown core, I'm wondering within my head, and maybe when we revise the OCP, we'll consider this, is the other side of Wharf Avenue considered part of that dense area that we're looking at in the downtown core? So, because this is definitely on just the other side of that, and it's situated in the middle of a lot of smaller buildings. So we have to consider that when we look at listening to the community and or approving this. And my other thought, just quickly, and then I'll look for maybe other council members to speak on this, because it is massing is fairly large, and it is quite high, although it meets a number of sustainability goals because of its location. It's near a transit route, and it masses a number of people in one area. So as we know, that definitely is a contradiction to sprawl. But the question I would ask is on this, another sustainability issue is if in fact they're willing to work with us, do we know if the proponents are willing to look at a different way of water catchment and or cisterns as part of this development? We once again heard there's enough water, but we keep talking about it, and this may be an opportunity to negotiate based on the size of the development in that area that they provide better ways of catching water and or storing it moving forward. So it's maybe not something considered, but it's something that I think we need to be responsible for now. And those are my initial comments. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. And Councillor Wright, initial comments.
Thank you, Your Worship. I noticed that you've got 5 units of affordable housing. Did you consider cash in lieu of the units?
That is something that we have a brief discussion about, and that is, there's current council policy that does say that is an option. So we haven't had kind of more detailed discussions about that yet, but it definitely is a possibility.
What's the cash in lieu amount compared to a market 4-bedroom condo on the 4th floor?
Yeah. So the current council policy is for $206,000 per unit in lieu. So compared to market rates, that varies between each unit. So,
Councillor Wright, any further follow-up on that? And who makes that call on affordable, whether it's cash in lieu or units? And I guess if it is units, then we've got the problem we ran into the Watermark, is that it may be affordable, but there's ongoing costs and assessment, strata costs and things of this nature. So we simply need to revise our affordable housing policy. If anyone in the world thinks we can get a $200,000 door in C-Shop, we'd have a whole ton of them, and we don't. And we have to make sure they're actually affordable for ordinary people that are working steady and sometimes 2 incomes in a house. Councillor Mueller?
Yeah, just a little comment on the view corridor analysis. Those of you that watched the planning committee meeting where this was discussed, there was a lot of discussion about the heights. Also, this development was not recommended by our advisory planning due to the heights issue. It's great to hear that we're going to be doing that work. I think that for staff, we need to be doing this ahead of time because a building of this size, it's clear in our policies that we need to understand how views are impacted. And when we do that, with this particular one, we're going to have to understand how they're impacted down Wharf Street, looking up the inlet, because that is the view that will be impacted. And we've got all those properties all the way down Wharf that could potentially have their views impacted, and they could also be seeking multi-family and large-scale development in the future. It's our downtown core. Another point that I think is really important is that this particular building is situated on a hump. So you know that the road down to the lighthouse drops some significant meters. So geographically, it doesn't lend itself to this. We have gone to this height before, but it's with large-scale concessions to deal with the issues and the impacts of heights. And people will remember the watermark, and people remember Spanny situations that we've gone to this height, but there was a lot of work involved. So I don't want to hear that the view analysis is an afterthought. It needs to be in the beginning of the process. Thanks.
Any further discussion from councillors? And then I have a few comments. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. On page 122, we'd just like to draw our attention to the statement. The water services available has been confirmed by the SCRD. In light of tomorrow's meeting, that's very appropriate that they would approve 47 units. Thank you.
Thank you. I've read this over. I didn't watch the planning committee meeting, so I didn't know, but there's much to commend this project to Sechelt. I really think the density is important. And I thought the 3 and 4 bedrooms in this kind of a setting, I think were really important. I'd really like to see those come forward. I have concerns about 2 things. One of them is it sounds like we're sending it to public hearing, and then they're willing to have revisions and potential changes. And that's not a process we like to support. I mean, we should be taking to public hearing the projects that we know we want to support and that they're ready to go. So I'm a little concerned, I'm quite concerned about that actually, because right in your report is an opportunity that they're going to explore other options on setbacks and height and density and so that's on the bottom of page 122. If they're going to do that, then I think they should do it. Figure out what that is and what the best proposal going forward is. I had one, I'm also concerned about the overall height as it fits into that neighborhood, but I happen to think that area from Wharf Street and the 4-way stop down through to the townhomes on the other side of the marsh is ripe for considerable density and infill housing. And I've talked to other developers who've come in to ask about things about consolidating property in that area. And from my mind, that looks like this could be the start of something fairly significant. And if they're built right, a number of them will have views up the inlet. So I understand why they're going for the height, but it's a big jump for the community. And the community, I would not be surprised at all if when we look at the view and the height constrictions and actually look at the mapping, that the community says because of the elevations where it starts, it's simply too high. So the other technical question I have is on your setbacks for above ground, they're 5 meters, 6 meters, whatever. And then for underground, the setbacks are 0 on all 4 lot lines, which is for the parking lot. So how does that work with the conservation of trees and the circling of all these major trees and fir trees you're going to keep? How can you build a parking lot that is subsurface and right at the level and then also keep trees? I don't think you can do it.
Yes, Your Worship. So a large amount of the site will be taken up by the building, so there won't be too many trees to maintain. However, there is, can I show the site plan? Here you can, so right in this corner here is actually, they aren't proposing to do a, there isn't going to be any undergrounding here. So there are some large mature trees in this corner here that they are going to be trying to maintain there.
And in the other, along that same lot line, are there more?
I'm not sure if these ones are on the property or not. Just kind of looking at it, they might be on the neighboring property.
Because when I first looked at this, I said, oh, that's really interesting. They're going to save a number of significant trees. And then when I got to the technical details, it said that it was going to be 0 setback for the parking lot. I thought trees need a little bit of room for roots. And so I just didn't know how you're going to do that. So it sounds like there's a bit of a contradiction in the overall planning. Any further discussion with the planner on this before we look at the recommendations? Councillor Inkster?
So based on the questions you asked and the information that is presented before us as to next steps, and if they make any substantive changes, would that not then have to go backwards? That is the legalistic concern that I would have in terms of changes made.
Well, I don't even have a legal concern about the public works, or going to a public hearing and coming back and forth, but there's certainly a public perception, and it'll be one more example of delay, which we can foresee, and the developer can foresee, but they seem to want to go through it. They seem to want to go to public hearing and then revise it and go back for another public hearing, and if we do 2 public hearings or 3, you know who's going to wear that. It won't be the staff or the developer. So if they're going to make changes and they're open to changes and they want to make changes, and it says in your report they're open to those things, I'd like to see some of that done before it gets stopped. So I'm not sure how to deal with that. Director Corbett.
I think one of the things that the applicant struggled with is, and really it's more of a risk on his point of, he's certainly open to feedback. He has been an exceptionally good applicant in that regard. I think one of the concerns he'd like to go to public hearing, if there needed to be other changes to do them all at once, it's quite a big cost to redesign twice. So I think that was one of the concerns that, depending on the feedback that is received and further direction from council, does it need, are we looking at something more significant? So I think that was the trade-off he was looking at, of doing it in a comprehensive manner if it needed to be done. Thank you.
Okay. There's lots of detail here, so we know what they're proposing, and the community can basically look at everything going on the site, so they should be able to get good feedback. So we have 5 recommendations. We've only received it, which is the first one, and we have recommendations 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are to give this first reading and move it forward to public hearing. Thank you, Councillor Seegers. Seconded by Councillor Inkster. Any further discussion of those at this point? Councillor Mueller.
Well, with this one, I think I was the only person to vote against recommendation number 3. Would have liked to see that dealt with separately so that I could then, again, register my issues around the height for zoning. If these go forward in a package, I'll probably have to vote against them all. But I just want to be clear that it's registering my issue with recommendation number 3, the height contained in the zoning bylaw that was turned back by our APC, and we had a lot of discussion around it. I just don't think the height issue is quite dealt with yet, and I don't feel comfortable recommending that to our community and the changes contained in it. Thanks.
Okay, I'll call for the vote by recommendations, even though they're all on the table as a package. So all of those in favor of recommendation 2, the official community plan amendment bylaw, be given first reading. Any opposed? That's carried. And recommendation 3, the zoning bylaw number 25, 1986, amendment bylaw number 25, 286, 2018, CD 42, Wade, be given first reading. All those in favor? Any opposed? 1 opposed. And 4, the official community plan amendment bylaw be considered in conjunction with the District of Sechelles financial plan, the district SCRD, Solid Waste Management Plan, R2000 Liquid Waste Management Plan, and the registration of the district's wastewater treatment plan. All those in favor? Any opposed on that? That's carried. And recommendation 5, the staff be authorized to schedule a public hearing. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Any idea when that public hearing may be?
Things to do first.
Sorry.
So we're looking at probably about 2 weeks to getting those technical reports in. And then afterwards, we'll look at scheduling that. So it might be around mid-May.
Thank you for that. So we'll go to first reading, which is item 8.4B of the official community plan amendment. First reading is moved by Councillor Seegers, seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? That's carried, none opposed. Public hearing, we'll just leave that. Then we go on to item 8.4C, which is first reading of the bylaw number 25-286, 2018, CD 42. A bylaw to amend District of Sechelt zoning bylaw number 25, 1987 by rezoning 3 properties in the Sechelt Village neighborhood from R2, residential 2 zone, to a new comprehensive development zone 42 in support of a mixed-use residential and commercial development. First reading is introduced by Councillor Seegers and Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? That's carried. If you don't mind, I'll call a 5-minute recess for this council meeting so we can stretch our legs, and we'll come back to item 8.5. Welcome back. Thank you, and we get to see who the real stalwarts are after our first break. So moving on to item 8.5, this is a rezoning for 5980 Seashell Inlet Road. First, a motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillor Lutz, and seconded by Councillor Wright. All those in favor? And I'll turn it back to the Director of Planning and Development, Ms. Corbett.
This is a rezoning application for an I-6 property from Lucien McCarter. So this is in front of you for second and third reading. You did see it earlier for first, and it did go to public hearing. So the notion, currently it is zoned rural 2 zone, wanting to go to I-6. This is in keeping with the area around it. There's an I-6 just to the south of it. In the OCP, it is intended for business and industry. This is the conceptual layout. A lot of that road pattern is really driven by both the lot sizes that are needed in there and a lot of topography issues, hence why the road at the north doesn't continue through. It's because of topography. The zoning request is to do essentially an I-6 modified zone. So at the request of members of the public, adjacent residential, they wanted some of the more impactful uses taken out of this zone. Those are the ones that would be coming out. There were concerns around noise, dust, that sort of thing. This is where we are in the process. We did have a public hearing on March 27th, largely quite positive. There were some, I'll go through some of the comments on here. This is kind of what was concerned about. Protection of the tree buffers, particularly along Seashell Inlet Road. So the applicant is working with us to maintain some of the clusters of the trees. There were concerns around if they just kept a strip, they'd be very vulnerable, likely to come down. So they're looking at doing clusters of trees along there. There were concerns around possible heron nesting area. We did have a report completed. He also kept an eye out for anything else we should be concerned about, and it was fine. There was a requirement for the archaeological study that is underway. They're working with First Nations on that. There was general support for light industry zoning. A number of people expressed a need to have this size of lots and having an equity stake in some of their to do industrial. There were requests for additional retail and residential uses. We did have conversation with the applicant to be clear that under an I-6, the only thing that can be a residential use in there is a caretaker unit. If the desire was to do more mixed use, because the applicant was actually speaking to that at the time, in the public hearing, and so we did emphasize with them that that was a desire. That's a different zone, so that was clarified. In the process and the next steps, the final adoption is conditional on our usuals, the tree permit, tree protection, the subdivision layout approval, signed servicing agreement that will go through that. We'll get the final, sometimes we don't always receive this, but they have assurance that it's been done on the field reconnaissance, and then registering a covenant to maintain the 5-meter vegetative buffer. That's at that small strip of agricultural land reserve at the south end. So in summary, the staff are very supportive of this application. It's in keeping with the zoning and the OCP. We did hold the public hearing, and the public feedback overall was very positive. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much for that report. Any questions of the director while we're here? If not, I'll look for somebody to move recommendations 2 and 3 on page 168. Thank you, Councillor Mueller and Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? That's carried, and that moves us then to the actual bylaws, which are before us for second and third reading. Bylaw number 25292, 2018, Luch and McCarter, a bylaw to amend District of Sechelt zoning bylaw number 25, 1987 by rezoning a property at 5980 Sechelt Inlet Road from RR2, Rural 2 Zone to I6, Industrial 6 Zone. Second reading is moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Lutz. Any discussion at second reading? All those in favor? And third reading is moved by Councillor Mueller and Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? That's carried. Thank you for that. It'll come back for adoption when servicing agreements, et cetera, are done. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. I just noticed on page 192 at the back of that, doesn't actually indicate in here when first reading and public hearing were done. Thank you.
Okay. No new business. Item 10, we've done 10.1, so we move to 10.2, which is a development variance permit regarding Resland development. First, a motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillor Shanks. Councillor Wright, all those in favor? That's carried, and we turn again to the Director of Planning and Development.
This is an application for a development variance permit that's actually affecting bylaw 430, so it's related to a panhandle. This development is located at the corner of McCourt and the Coast Highway. This is the conceptual layout. So the problem that arose with this, from a lotting perspective, they needed access to that lot that's identified in yellow. When the road improvements are done to that intersection, it's going to raise the grade on that, so it would make access directly off the road very complex. And so there's an existing driveway right now for that older house, but the grade will be raised in there. So it meant they couldn't access off there. They needed to come in off that cul-de-sac. And concern was in terms of keeping the lot sizes to above 600 meters, they needed to shrink the panhandle. So we did have discussion with and did technical analysis on this with the fire department, the engineering department, to see if that could be accommodated. They were in agreement. It was subject to some conditions and some improvements on the site. So one of the things that the fire department wanted is to have access essentially off McCourt. That's essentially for their hoses, so that if they had to fight fire, they can actually access off that area and get into that area. It is not a public walkway. I think I went through all that, and that is the... Sorry, I think I just skipped my recommendation. Okay. The other thing, sorry, let me go back to here. Sorry, there's my recommendation. Thank you. So what we're looking for is approval on the development variance. In terms of this case, the variance is fairly straightforward. But what triggered it is something that I think we need to relook at some of our development permit area requirements. One of the things that was of concern here is that we have a development permit area, intensive residential, and it applies to anything below 500 meters. That means that most of our developers will aim to keep the lots well above that. And so that they don't kick into that, it's onerous to them, and that particular DPA is less than linear, shall we say. So it is one I think it needs to be relooked at, because it is actually leading to us in doing larger lots. It's not the most efficient use of land, and we get into some where the lotting pattern could have been improved. So it's one where I think we're not getting the right outcome. So that is something that in the future I'd like to bring back to council and have a look at, because I think it's not having quite the intended effect. But for the purpose of this one, the development variance is supported by staff, both in planning and engineering, and we are recommending approval. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Seegers.
Sorry, just clarification. You're saying that if it's under 500 square meters? Under 600 square meters, then they're subject to a DPA zone for intensive infill? Intensive residential, thank you.
Councillor Inkster.
Obviously, the staff report's fairly straightforward, and there's been good explanation, but I just wanted to turn council's attention. There's a number of developments in that area, and as we move forward for future planning and their infrastructure work, that Bly Road is disintegrating to the point where it was actually a letter that came in to us. There was a letter to the editor last week referring to that particular road, and that actually borders this proposal to, I guess we call it the north, and it borders another proposal that's just, I guess, to the west of this proposal that's also in the works and has a sign up for development. So I think we just need to consider that as we move forward, because we could probably work with these proposals to make sure that that road is brought up to standard, safety and otherwise. Thanks.
Councillor Shanks.
Just as a comment, Your Worship, I did have a meeting with West Sechelt Community Association, and that was one of the questions I brought back to staff, and they informed me that this particular development will be paying for a portion of those improvements to Bly Road, and the one in question to the west on Bly Road will pay for the other portion, basically. So it's going to happen. So.
That's good news, and that's how development and growth should work. Bring everybody up to the same standard. So we have a recommendation for number 2 in front of us for development variance permit number 2179. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, for getting that moved and on the floor, and it's seconded by Councillor Mueller. Any further discussion? All those in favor? That's carried. Good. And one more. Business item 10.3. Report be received. Thank you, Councillor Seegers again, and Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? And briefly on the Rona.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. This application is for a development variance for the Rona development on Wharf Avenue. This area is comprised of 3 lots, and so this affects the variance to a degree in that because they're not doing all 3 lots, there were certain things they wouldn't have been required to do for that middle lot, so there's been some negotiation to make this site work. It is a commercial 4 zone. So the proposal essentially is to upgrade the aging racks that are on that property. They have been able to take advantage of some investment funding coming through Lowe's because they have taken over Rona, so there's some money available for them. So it'll allow them to really clean up that site quite a bit and clean up the front end of it. So the variance so there's 2 variances, one to our zoning bylaw, one to bylaw 430. So the variance to our zoning bylaw is the rear lot line setbacks, request to move them from 3 meters to 0 meters. And there are a couple of things driving this. One is the size of the racking is a set size. And so on that lower one, on the south one, they need to be able to fit behind that existing building and access it. So that's driving the setback on that one. And on the one to the north side, they have to work around the property line, and so it's pushing it back. In terms of impact on the site itself, That's a currently existing condition. There is a lot of racking and storage that's against that rear lot line, but it will allow them to consolidate a lot of those materials and open up the middle a whole lot more where the hydro line is. So the net impact from a visual perspective should actually be reduced. The variance to bylaw 430 is for the sidewalk width, for the streetlights and the undergrounding of utilities. So in terms of the sidewalk width, under the bylaw 430, they're required to put a 2-meter sidewalk in. The one in the middle is 1.5, and to the south of them is a 1.5. So what we wanted to do, rather than have a hole in the middle of that, is to have a consistent 1.5 meter sidewalk along there. Also allows for a little bit of an edge treatment against the fence. At such time as they redevelop the site, we would make them complete that to the standard of 2 meters. With the utility servicing, they're actually required to do the undergrounding of the hydro and the telephone poles in there, and the street lights. And so again, the agreement here was we would do that through restrictive covenant, and at such time as there's more redevelopment, we would look at the undergrounding. This is an issue that we probably need to have a little more strategy around. It's kicking into a number of our developments. And unless we do it kind of on a corridor basis, it doesn't really give you a great benefits, but it is enormously expensive. Particularly along this line, it's quite a significant hydro line. So it is something we will probably come back to council on, of a better strategy, so that we're looking at certain areas to do that and be more upfront with what's required and when. This is the existing site. You can see the materials, the existing building. That one at the top one is the south end building, so that's one of where some of the new racking will go. This gives an indication of what is already up against that rear lot line. This is the sidewalk condition, so the kind of holes in the fabric there that we're hoping to improve. It has gone, went to Planning Committee March 28th, went to Accessibility Advisory Committee. They were fine with the sidewalk. What they noted was that everything below that, there's a lot of encumbrances on that sidewalk that are very dangerous. Went to Oak for statutory public notification on the 6th, and the reconnaissance study is underway. So our recommendation is to approve the variance to the rear lot lines and the sidewalk requirements, and waiving the requirements of the undergrounding of the utilities and doing the street lights another time. It actually will kick in whenever there's a new building permit on there. So that is the recommendation, and that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And the recommendation that we have on page 257, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Lutz moving, and that we approve the variance permits as presented in the attached permit. And there's the full draft permit is on page 262 to 263. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor? Thank you. I'm pleased we were able to support that for that particular corporate citizen, and I'll be very interested when you come back with new thinking on undergrounding. We'll just wait until you come to talk about that. That concludes the business items, and we're now into item 11. Not too bad, actually. Reports from councillors. If I could start on my far left with Councillor Wright and move along, and then we'll return to him as the SCRD rep. So first, any council report, Director Wright.
Director Wright, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Your Worship.
We're preparing for a meeting tomorrow at 9:30 where he will be Director Wright at the SCRD. That's what happened there. I didn't promote him within the district of Sechelt. I jumped myself ahead 7 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours.
Gee, I'm glad you cleared that up. I thought I was going to have to be at work at 7 in the morning with Mr. Stewart tomorrow. Anyway, on behalf of the District of Sechelt, attended a number of meetings, Finance Committee, where we're finalizing and doing a lot of the final parts of the budget, which was passed tonight. Attended the Davis Bay Community Association. I went to the Association of Vancouver Island Coastal Communities Conference, which is a Friday, Saturday, Sunday conference, and attended a number of sessions there. Most of them were pretty good, and there'll be other counselors who will speak to that, so I'll let that go at that. And then today we had a community forest workshop, and that concludes my report for the District of Sechelt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. April 5th and 6th, so the weekend before AVICC, I was invited to a small conference, invitation only. It was with CEOs, presidents, VPs, chairs of large public and private corporations in Canada and the US. Fascinating conversation around board relationships, working with external stakeholders, and building strategic organizational partnerships. And April 11th, I attended the Self-Employed Women's Network AGM. There were about 100 women from up and down the coast who attended that. The chair had difficulty in getting us to stop talking so that we could actually have the meeting. So it's a great networking opportunity, and that was discussed as well, and some of the benefits of being part of that organization. I attend ABICC as mentioned by Councillor Wright. Sorry, we're all getting tired, I think. I'll mention a couple of the sessions that we attended. A few of us attended the cannabis regulation after legislation, and it was presented by province and legal, and what they indicated was that it's very difficult for the province to put together legislation to provide guidance to municipalities because they're waiting on the federal government. So they've put some stuff in place, but are having to be very responsive in a very short time frame. So we're kind of lagging behind that. And what we do will also depend on what the other two do. There was an affordable housing initiatives, there was a session on affordable housing initiatives coming forward, both around funding and zoning, and that's provincial and federal funding. Councillor Lutz and I attended the Social Procurement Hub workshop, which was very interesting. There have been a couple of municipalities who have done some preliminary work on this, kind of spearheading it and doing the groundwork, and they'll be coming forward with some information for us to be able to bring forward to our councils. I attended 2 sessions, one on open space and one on tools for resilient shorelines. The one I probably found most fascinating, though, a couple of them were on technology. So I attended an info session on the possibility of tech and innovation. And a couple of the statistics they gave was they said currently about 25% of economic development growth in the world is coming from tech and digital services. And they're forecasting that by 2025, 50% will come from economic development, from tech and digital services. And they said most municipalities and areas look outside their community and try to entice tech companies to come. But instead, what they're finding is that 80% of growth typically comes from within the existing jobs and businesses that already exist in our communities. So it's how do we take what's existing and actually leverage the tech and innovation with them. And one of the things we did inside that was design thinking exercise, which I've never taken part in before. It was very interesting. So that's my report. Thanks.
Thank you for that report. And Councillor Mueller.
Yes, thank you. I've attended the other meetings mentioned by some of the other councillors. I did not go to ABICC this year, just couldn't fit it in. It's unfortunate, but it has felt like a busy couple weeks. I think partly because of the writing that I've been doing, that's an extra few hours a week. And then what I wanted to mention actually is Oceans Day. We've started organizing Oceans Day. I do tend to work on about one event a year, give or take, whatever I can fit in my schedule. This year I'm doing Oceans Day with the coordinator from the SCCA, and not the SSC. And anyways, our first organizing meeting is going to be May 1st, 7 p.m. at the Rockwood Dining Room. And anyone who's interested in helping organize that, you feel free to come. It's council, staff, public. And then the event itself is going to be June 9th between 12 and 4 p.m. at Friendship Park. If any of the community associations are watching, they've got a letter from me asking them to be involved as well. And I'd like to talk about anyone who wishes to work about that. I'm really excited about this event. It's going to be fantastic. And we've got another 2 months to put together. So I'm sure you'll be hearing more about that from me later on.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Mueller has been working since for 14 hours and 15 minutes. He started work at 7 this morning. So if he confuses one acronym with the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association, that's quite all right. We know who he's working with. And Councillor Lutz.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a busy couple of weeks with committee meetings, and in the middle of it, the Vancouver Island Coastal Communities. I attended and got a fair amount of information around the derelict boats or vessels of concern, and was pleased to hear that there has been some hiring within the Coast Guard, transportation, and fish and wildlife that will help to deal with some of those issues we have here and in the rest of Canada. Keynote speaker was very interesting. I enjoyed his talk on happy communities. Premier Horgan, first time in, I believe it was 16 years that we have had a premier at our conference. He spoke and spoke well. Andrew Weaver was before us, and just a little dynamo, Selena Robinson. She had a lot of information for us. The one thing I want to talk about coming forward in the next short while is Saturday, April 28th, is the day of mourning. And for the first time, the District of Sechelt will have a marker in which to have the ceremony. So that's Saturday, April 28th at 11 o'clock, right here in Sechelt. So I hope that everyone can be there. Thank you. That's my report.
It's right here in Block 7, Spirit Square, next door, so in terms of the location. Councillor Shanks.
Thank you, Your Worship. I had some interesting meetings over the last couple of weeks, notably a meeting with the SDBA, and where I had some concerns about criticism of various decisions this council has made. And I somewhat took them to task in terms of, if you want the information, I'm there as your liaison. Please ask me for the information and I'll give it to you. I then attended the West Sechelt Community Association, and they had sent out 8 or 9 questions. They wanted me to respond to at that meeting. The meeting went exceptionally well. They were pleased with some of our notable responses in terms of moving sewer costs around, especially. And then they came back with half a dozen other questions, and within a 2 or 3 day turnaround, I had responses to those that I could then forward on to the West Sechelt Community Association. So all in all, it worked out extremely well, and I'm very thankful that I'm the liaison person in West Sechelt Community Association this time around. Many different issues, but I think they were satisfied with the answers I provided and the answers that staff have provided too. I too attended the AVICC. I haven't done for quite some time, but I guess notable were the speakers on happy communities, technical and innovation, and derelict vessels. But I think I was particularly taken by the incredible response that Selena Robinson got. And is she, what's her position in, is it municipal?
Yep.
Municipal?
And other things.
Yeah. Here's a fireball. I mean, I've seen her before as the NDP critic on various things, but I've never really known her. But just, I thought an excellent presentation and standing ovation for this young lady for her perseverance and the job that she's been doing. So I was particularly impressed with that. Thank you very much.
Started out as a community concerned about an issue in her neighborhood, became a councillor, now is the Minister of Municipal Affairs, Housing and TransLink. So it's quite a file. And Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, it was good to hear where she said she was from, which was one of my old neighborhoods before we moved to the coast. The last week started interesting before we went to ABICC with, we had a good solar panel discussion with School District 46 on why they put the program of solar panels together and what their actual return rate on it is. And that information was reported, I guess, minuted by staff, and a report will probably either go to council, probably go through Public Works to council to talk about a revision to some of the figures that we were previously given that a couple of council members have had questions about. So that's good. And just to give council a heads up, the revision has went substantially downward in terms of the return on providing that technology, but it's still may be a little high depending on how we look at why we're doing it, if it's all about dollars or if it's for a combination of that and other reasons. Going to AVICC and a number of the reports that we received, it was good to hear from a number of political leaders in British Columbia and hear them speak on a number of issues. And it was good to see sort of considering what's going on in BC right now, to hear from the Premier and to hear from the leader of the Greens, and then to see one being interviewed like crazy on TV over the next number of days, Andrew Weaver, by a number of different people, including the business people. So I have a theory on pipelines, but on the pipeline issue, but I'm not going to necessarily say it publicly, but I have a theory. Anyway, in terms of the other presentations that we received at the ABICC, the Happy City one was good. I think that I have the book, and I think one other council member has it. It might be Councillor Lutz. And I would, and you do as well. Good. I would encourage those that, I mean, I can also lend mine out, but I encourage people to lend read that book and/or get one. So I think it's about 300 pages, but it's something, and I encourage the public to look at it because it speaks to, I think, where we need to go as communities in terms of, we live in communities, but we want to be happy in those communities. And, it's sort of Maslow's theory of hierarchy, right, of self-actualization and happiness. So, read that book. It's got some good ideas, and it's got some little hints about some of the decisions we've made lately. And you should maybe look to that book, and you'll see what I'm referring to. Why we think we're going in a good direction to make Sechelt happier. In terms of some of the other presentations that were there, the Green Shores one that was referenced by Councillor Seegers is a good one because it reminds us that we have to look at coastline protection and how we will deal with that with rising sea levels and wave action. And the Green Shores, which is a graduated entrance to the ocean rather than the walls that humans have been building, is probably, as we go forward, a more affordable, smart way as we continue to develop along our oceans, and it introduced some best practices. I also wanted to just quickly touch on, because it's been late and I've had a lot to say, on the opioid issue, that because I did see some of the other things that were presented, but I'll just end on the opioid discussion that we were presented. It looks like a number of communities have developed sort of teams and/or situational ways of dealing with that particular crisis. And through the teams that they put together, they've lowered the death rate, which is still quite high. And it's high throughout British Columbia, so it's not just a Sunshine Coast or Vancouver problem. So they put teams together to identify where they think the issues are geographically, and are working with those areas to lower the rates of death. So it's good to hear that there has been some medical intervention, and we'll see if they can lower it to 0, but of course there are those people that are doing bad things to drugs, and hopefully they deal with them as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that report. I'll just say it was busy. It was good to attend some of the sessions at AVICC. I also had an opportunity in the last week to meet with our Member of Parliament and our MLA, as I want us to be prepared for the various housing initiatives that are coming from the federal government in the future, and the 30-point plan that the province is putting together and was addressed by Selena Robinson, Minister Robinson. And just seems to have been busy with lots of what I call political work and keeping in touch with the community. Probably my most keeping in touch with the CAO. Enjoyed briefing and then being debriefed by the CAO on his visit to the East Porpoise Bay Association. And I'll move then to 11.2, SCRD Board, Council Representatives Report. I'll start with the newest director at the Sunshine Coast Regional District, Director White. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Worship. It was interesting. We had 2 Thursdays where there was no meeting, and most of the SCRD meetings are on Thursday. And then the day that we were all traveling to AVICC, of course, there's a planning and development meeting at 9:30 in the morning. And then there was a board meeting at 1:30. And then everybody scrambling to get out of the board meeting to make it over to Victoria. However, at the planning and development meeting, there was a number of items on there. The bulk of them were amendments to official community plans in the various rural areas. There were some development variance applications. There was a report on a cemetery bylaw report increasing the fees, and there wasn't really anything of real substantial impact to the District of Sechelt. I then attended an agenda planning for infrastructure committee, and I don't very often talk about what I'm going to be doing in the future, but tomorrow there is an infrastructure committee meeting at the SCRD. And for anybody who's interested, there is 6 reports on water and 1 delegation also on water. So anybody at this table or out here or beyond, feel free to attend that meeting. I'm sure it'll be a full house and it'll be really interesting. And Pam wants to get out of here. She's pointing at her watch. Oh, it's at 9:30, infrastructure. So, yeah. And that concludes my report.
A little bit of pre-advertising for local government. They don't get the attendance that we get at Sechelt. We had a nice full house this evening, and I was glad to see a lot of people here. Hopefully they're thinking about the fact that it's an election year, and they'll be interested in getting on council. But the SCRD has very quiet meetings, so tomorrow they might have a few more for the water session. Okay, items for information and release. Item 12. First one is 12.1, release of items from our closed meetings. First a motion, well, the recommendation. Thank you, Councillor Seegers. Seconded by Councillor Lutz. That council and the recommendation that we, well, all those in favor? Release. And what we just released was that the council appoint the District of Sechelt corporate officer as chief election officer for the 2018 general elections, and the district's human resources advisor be appointed deputy chief election officer. So they're getting prepared for the administrative side and organizational side of that. And I'm sure people are getting organized for the non-administrative side of that election. Sechelt Visitor Center March statistics, March 28, page 266 to 271. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Wright. All those in favor? Any comments or discussion on those? Yeah, someday we'll have to sit down and go through those carefully. Sunshine Coast RCMP, March 2018 monthly motion to receive. Thank you, Councillor Mueller and Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? Any highlights? Sechelt's doing okay. Lower crime rate. And finally, Motion to receive the council correspondence. Thank you, Councillor Mueller and Councillor Seekers. All those in favor? That's carried. And one of those items? Councillor Inkster.
So just a very thin council correspondence this time, but I'm just a heads up to some information we received recently. It'll probably go on our future correspondences. I hope we have an opportunity to talk about Mayor Rowe's letter that came to us the other day. I think that we should, as a council, discuss that because I have some ideas.
Yes, and that's actually going to be discussed tomorrow at the Sunshine Coast Regional District. So the town of Gibsons is quite interested in new governance models for coordinating and collaborating on water issues on the Sunshine Coast. In particular, anything that might be close by or in the proximity of what some people call the Mount Elphinstone Aquifer and others call the Gibsons Aquifer. The Gibsons Aquifer is of great concern to the town of Gibsons. I think they had a report where they showed they needed they'd need full access to that aquifer by 2055. We might think we can borrow some of the water between now and then. So that will be part of the discussion tomorrow, and it will come back to this council for full discussion as well. Motion to adjourn. Thank you. Thank you. All those in favor? Not opposed. Few moments for questions. Pam.